Hey pals, I'm here today to do a tag video, and that is the reading taste tag, which has been created by Harriet over at Harriet Rosie, and she's very kindly tagged me in it, which I was very happy to see because I really like these questions and I think they really promote people thinking more deeply about their reading and what things in particular they like and don't like. And yeah, I just enjoy all these sort of conversations. So the first question is probably the hardest one, and that is to describe your reading taste in one sentence. I've really sort of ummed and ahed about this the last couple of days, and I've landed on a very short sentence, which I will have to explain, so I'm probably cheating. And that is snobby, but not too snobby. So I think as a reader, my primary concern is writing style. A book can have a plot that I like with good character development, but if I think the writing style is a bit too basic, I probably won't continue with it. It's rare that I would read a book like that, because for me, what really gets me to be sort of lost in a world and really enjoy a book and admire the author is the writing style. And so there are a lot of really popular books that I haven't enjoyed because when I've read them, I think they're quite basic. In terms of sentence structure is just quite basic. The sort of vocabulary that's used is quite simple. But also if they're dealing with any sort of socio-political issues, they deal with them in a really sort of introductory beginner's way. And I find that even if a topic comes up in a book that I know very little about, I would still rather it's not simplified, because I would rather as a reader pause and go and look into that thing and then come back. I don't want it sort of served really easily on a platter for me, because I just think sometimes that does an injustice to pretty complicated issues. So that's why I'd say I'm quite a snobby reader. But I say not too snobby because I think I read a certain type of sort of literary fiction, but there's a sort of step further than that, which are books that are much more focused on readers who have a really good knowledge of political issues and historical issues across the world. And I tend to find that I'm just not smart enough for some of those books. Even if I go away and look into them, I'd need to read a whole nonfiction book or watch a whole documentary series to have the level of knowledge I feel is appropriate to really take on board the book's message. But I also find that there's a certain type of literary fiction that usually feels like it's written by somebody who's really intelligent, that I think feels quite cold and clinical and distant, and I hate that as a reader. That's my number one turn off. And that's something I sort of struggle to know from a blurb, because a book can be described and I can think that sounds great, that's all the themes I'm interested in, everyone's saying the writing style's really good, but then I start to read it and I'm like, okay, it might be really good, but it's not the sort of thing I enjoy because there feels like there's a remove, and as a reader I hate that remove to be there. I want to be as close up as I can possibly be. So yeah, I think snobby but not too snobby works for that. I hope it does anyway. The next question is to describe your reading taste with categories, for example, genre, age, length. Age is the easiest. I probably read 90 to 95% adult fiction and non-fiction. And predominantly that's because of what I just said. My main concern is writing style. And I find in particular with YA, which is bizarre, right? Because middle grade children's books are for younger readers. I find that a lot of what is popular, and this isn't me, talking about a whole genre, but a lot of what's really popular and what sells is very plot heavy, really fast plot, which I hate, and really simple writing style, and really tropey. And I don't like any of those things. So I prefer middle grade children's to YA, but I don't tend to read a ton of either of them. I'm much more drawn to books written for adults. Length, I think I am more likely to enjoy a book that's 300 pages or up, and I think that's probably because the type of writing style I like is fairly verbose. I like writing style where the sentences are fairly long and there's a decent level of description. I like to be able to picture a room if I'm in it, or a landscape. And I'm really interested in the small details of a scene, and I really like strong character development, and I think all those things are fairly hard to do in less than 300 pages. So yeah, my sweet spot is probably between 300 and 500 pages, but there's a certain genre I'm into that sort of skews that being fantasy, which I'll discuss in a bit. And then genre, I'll briefly mention here sort of my main genres, and I'll go into more detail in the next question. So my main genres, and some of these I don't know if you'd even class as genres really, but literary fiction takes up a large portion of what I read. Is it really a genre? Probably not. But then when people say like, what type of films do you enjoy? I always feel like it feels weird to just say dramas. But I think that's like the film equivalent of literary fiction. So I predominantly read literary fiction, but I also really enjoy memoirs and essay collections that tend to be a blend of the personal and the socio-political. And then I also enjoy fantasy, although I have incredibly specific tastes in fantasy. So I would say 90% of the fantasy books out there I do not like, because of all the issues I just said I have, which is that I feel like in the last 10 years in particular, adult fantasy has started leaning much closer to what we review as YA fantasy. I think that is because a lot of what was popular in the YA genre was fantasy. Those readers then wanted like the next step. And so, like publishers saw a way to entice people into adult fantasy. It feels like it's a little step between them. So I'm talking about books, for example, like The Poppy Wall by R.F. Kuang, where we're focusing on a young protagonist, which is absolutely fine. I read lots of books with young protagonists that I would view as books written for adults. But the tone, the emotional discussions and the pacing, the writing style, all of that is quite simple, and there's quite a lot of tropes. All of that I would associate with the most popular type of YA books, and so because of that, I'm not a massive fan of what is being published in fantasy at the moment. I probably enjoyed fantasy that was being published from like 1985 to 2005, although it's then really difficult to avoid a lot of stuff that I find offensive in fantasy. Hence why I don't like, for someone who likes fantasy, I don't like most fantasy. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. The next question is to show us a few books that represent your reading taste. And I think this is going to be sort of the easiest way for me to get across what my reading tastes are. I have a stack of books here. I could have gone on and on and on, but I do have a list of about 20 videos that I've been planning to do for forever, where I recommend books on a theme. And I guess a lot of these will be like one book from each of those themed videos. So you can let me know down below like which videos you're most excited to see like as soon as possible. The first thing I absolutely love is family dramas. I have like so many family dramas I have read and loved and would recommend, and so many more I want to read. The one I read last summer, which I absolutely adored, is The Arsonist City by Hala Alian. And the reason I've held this one up is because this also features a couple of other things in literary fiction that I really enjoy. In fact, I enjoy it in in fantasy as well. And that is multiple point of views and like non-chronological narratives. I love what that can do for a story. I think when you have multiple perspectives, you get to see the same moment from different people's points of view, and that can just be so revealing. I think it teaches you to like be a good person, because whenever I come across things in life, where someone maybe is acting in a way that's like rude or inappropriate, I always try and consider like where they might be coming from. And that's what this type of structure in novels gives you. And then the non-chronological narrative I like because I think it's really good at revealing a key moment, a sort of mystery that really changes dynamics between characters. So when you read a book that's non-chronological, the author can purposefully avoid a really key moment that actually happened quite early in a character's life, and they can write around that moment, the point where you start to think, well, something must have happened, but I'm not sure what, and then like actually that thing's revealed right at the end. I really like that as a construct, and I think that both of these things, multiple POV and non-chronological narratives, aren't things I would recommend to people who are like just started getting into books. So Johnny quite often asks me to recommend books to him, and I always avoid books like this one because I think you have to pay a bit more attention. But that's something I really enjoy doing as a reader. So it just works for me. Like so many books on my shelves feature these things. And I have a lot of, like I said, family dramas. So this is an example of like 3 things I really enjoy. Therefore, I would very much recommend this book. The next one is also multiple POV and non-chronological, and that is The Night Watch by Sarah Waters. I'm holding this one up to represent my enjoyment of historical fiction, although I will say Sarah Waters has like spoiled most historical fiction for me because she's just the best historical fiction writer. I love all of her books. So The Night Watch is so interesting, and I can't think of any novels that have done it exactly like this, and I would love to read more. So if you know of any, please do recommend them. This novel's told backwards. So it starts in, this is told, I'm trying to think of the precise year. It starts in 1947, and I think it goes back maybe like just more than 10 years, maybe about 12 years. So it starts after World War II in London, and you see this group of characters, sort of 5 or 6 characters, and their interactions with one another that you don't completely understand because you don't have the context for their relationships. And then the novel goes backwards in increments. I think it goes backwards every couple of years, and then you get a chunk in that section. And it sounds like that wouldn't work, like, well, how does the plot work? But it really does, because I won't spoil anything. But it's actually quite a devastating novel, because in the first section that you read at the end, they're in these quite nice moments with one another as characters, but you know that isn't where their story ends. And I think it also is like this interesting comment about the fact that, like, you know, when a novel ends, that isn't always the ending for those characters. So even if we're given a happy ending in the novel, more stuff could happen in the years after that that isn't happy. So yeah, I find this such an interesting novel to read, and I think it must have been really tricky to do, and I think she does a brilliant job at doing it. Another one, if you've hung around here for any length of time, you know I love coming of age narratives, particularly focused on young girls, and one of my favourite books of that type is The Unseen World by Liz Moore. We follow this young girl coming of age. From memory, this is told from the perspective of her sort of looking back when she's much older, and I just loved it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a certain type of nostalgia. I think in your childhood and adolescence, there's so much about you that's changing. So it's really interesting to look at somebody during the most sort of formative years of their life. But I also think it can be really interesting to read from a child's perspective where you understand the scenes more than the person telling you them. So a child may not understand some of the things that are happening around them, but you as the adult reader do. And that can be really heartbreaking, because if some of those things are actually quite horrible, then you might know that child's in a dangerous position or in a vulnerable position where the child doesn't know yet. And I also just think there's lots of joy and freedom in childhood that can just be a really lovely thing to read about. So yeah, I absolutely love coming of age narratives. I think I did a video recommending some years ago, but I'm hoping to do another one soon with like an updated list, and I really want to reread this one before I do that. Next 2 are quite specific themes that I enjoy, but I thought I would include them because I have been seeking out these themes more and more in the last few months, and also I thought you could give me recommendations for them. And the first one is White Ivy by Susie Yang. So I've realised I really enjoy literary fiction books that have a sort of thriller or like dark, twisty element to them. I don't want to spoil anything about this book, but there's a lot of books that get compared to The Secret History of Donna Tartt. I haven't read that book since I was 16. I plan to reread it this year. But this is the book in all the years since reading that one that I think comes closest. And I think mainly that's down to the writing style. Donna Tartt and Susie Yang have a writing style that's very decadent and rich and detailed, and really focuses on, I think, really show class and sort of wealth through their descriptions, and also, you know, you deal with sometimes characters that you don't really like but you sort of still root for. I don't really want to give much away at all about this, but the premise of this is we follow this young Chinese American girl who grows up to be a woman, who interacts with these 2 white American men who inhabit really different places in society, and one is from a really poor working class background and one is from a really upper class background, and he is sort of representative of like the all-American boy. He's like, is what we would picture when we picture the all-American boy. And she is desperate to assimilate. She wants to, avoid her background of being Chinese American and being from a poor family, and she will do everything, fight tooth and nail, throw people under the bus to do that. And it's quite a dark narrative. And I've realised this is something I really enjoy. I can probably only think of like 8 books that fit this that I've really enjoyed. I would love there to be more, so please feel free to recommend me like literary fiction books with like a dark, twisty narrative. And the next one sort of covers a couple of things that I really enjoy that are more down to location. I think I'm someone who really enjoys when location is a character. That a couple of locations I really enjoy are either remote locations, usually islands, love an island, and also rural locations. I love nature writing. I love writing that focuses on like describing the weather and is really atmospheric. And I think those things can be done really well in rural locations or on islands. And one that I really enjoyed is Night Waking by Sarah Moss. I just had to hold Sarah Moss book up in this video when talking about my reading tastes, because I think she gets, when I think of my reading taste, she's one of the authors that immediately pops up in my mind. Her writing style can be quite descriptive, her sentences can be quite long, but I really enjoy all the themes she focuses on. And in particular, this has a bit of a dark, twisty historical narrative to it, but we're focusing on a mother who is on a remote Scottish island with her husband while he's studying the puffins, and she's trying to look after her 2 young sons, and she's really not coping. And it's called Night Waking because she keeps waking up in the night to go to them, and it feels like she's sort of starting to lose her mind because of the lack of sleep. And it's a really interesting family drama with sort of like this historical aspect to it. But I just love the setting, and would really recommend that one. The next sort of category is a broader one, and that is fantasy. I'm going to hold up a Robin Hobb book here because of course I am, and I'm just holding up the first one in the sort of vast realm of the Elderling series because I think that's easiest for people, and that's Assassin's Apprentice, which is part of the Farseer trilogy. So, like I said, I don't enjoy the majority of fantasy out there, but when I find the fantasy book I enjoy, it probably makes me happier than enjoying any other type of book, because even though I read fantasy that is quite dark in terms of like horrible things are happening to the characters, like, Fitz goes through the ringer in these books, and like the end of the world might be happening, I don't walk away feeling like sad in terms of like our world, because this isn't our world, like it's another world. So yeah, it's really weird. Even though I could get really emotional and really cry whilst reading a fantasy book, it doesn't make me feel low afterwards because it feels so separate to my life and to our world. So fantasy is, if we say that we read books for escape, I would argue that fantasy is the purest form of escape you can have because it is removed from our world. So I love that. More specifically, I tend to enjoy mid to high fantasy that leans towards the epic. So what I mean by that is I'm not a fan of low fantasy. I'm going to put this down now. Low fantasy is, so low and high means how close is it to the real world. So low fantasy, for example, something like Jade City by Fonda Lee, yes, the countries have different names, but it is, there's cars, guns, phones, and then there's this sort of magic system within that. I'm not a massive fan of that because it doesn't feel separate enough from our world. I much prefer fantasy that feels separate from our world. So things like, dragons, elves, orcs, all those things make a book high fantasy. Something like Lord of the Rings is a great example. It's high fantasy, all the different creatures in it. Something like Game of Thrones is more mid because, it's pretty similar to Great Britain in terms of the geography. And if you think about it, Game of Thrones is in large part a political fantasy. You could really remove any of the magical elements and it would probably still stand up as a really great political drama. But the White Walkers and the dragons make it, a bit more fantastical. So Robin Hobb is somewhere mid, but her books are epic because a book is epic fantasy when the actions of the characters could be saving like the whole country or the whole world. which is certainly what Fitz is doing. I enjoy that because I think it is interesting to see a character sort of deal with the weight of responsibility of that. And yeah, I love getting lost in a fantasy world. I love what series can do for your attachment to characters. You know, when you think about a lot of the books I read, literary fiction, I spend one book with a character and then I'm done. To spend this many books with a character is a wonderful thing if you enjoy that character, and you enjoy seeing their progression. It's just a delight. And that's something that fantasy can really offer, because most fantasy books are part of a series. So there is that. The next one is essay collections, and the one I have to hold up here is White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Portrays Women of Colour by Ruby Hamad. This is one of my favourite reads. I think last year, as you can tell, I tabbed a lot. I really enjoy essay collections. I enjoy sort of personal essay collections, but what I really like is when an author sort of includes themselves in the collection. So, for example, Ruby Hamad references some situations she's been in where she's dealt with racism, but in large part the book is focused on, each essay is focused on a slightly different theme around the title, and she really delves into the historical context of racism against women of colour and how white women have upheld that. And I learned a lot from this. There was loads of points where I was like, oh, I didn't know that, that's really interesting. So that's something I want. I really want to learn things I didn't already know from essay collections. But I also want to be challenged in terms of like a thought process that I maybe wouldn't have put together myself. And I really want to have to like think about that. And I think what nonfiction has really done for me over the years is made me much less ignorant and much more able to empathise with people's positions, and to, whenever I'm sort of introduced to a new way of living, to think about it before I pass judgment. And yeah, that's something I really love nonfiction for. And the last one I have is a memoir, and that is Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Cho. I have a physical edition, but I listened to this on audio, which I'd highly recommend. She narrates it beautifully. I love memoirs, and I've said this plenty of times. I think memoirs, for me, the type of memoirs I enjoy, have the ability to have the most beautiful writing style, because I think that what a memoir at its heart is trying to do is to get as close to truth as possible. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, because our memory isn't infallible. I have an awful memory. And people remember moments differently. And so I think to try and articulate that is an art form. And I think it allows for a lot of just really beautiful writing. And like, this is such a beautifully written book. I'd highly recommend it, although probably not if you are a young mother or pregnant or anything, you know, connected to those things. So yeah, I love memoirs. They're some of my favourite books. They're the books I'm probably most likely to tab, because I just think, oh my God, that's just like breathtaking, and how did somebody like even come up with that sentence? And this is definitely a good example of that. The next question is to mention a book I didn't enjoy that felt like it would be my taste. A recent book that I thought I'd enjoy and I DNF'd is Wayward by Amelia Hart. Again, down to writing style. The premise of this book sounds quite similar to The Bassrock by Evie Wyld that I loved. So it's historical fiction with 3 narratives. One is actually contemporary, and it's a woman fleeing from a relationship that has domestic abuse within it. She has inherited a cottage from her aunt. So the second narrative is her aunt in, I think, the early 1900s. And then the third narrative is a woman who has been accused of being a witch, I think maybe back in like the 1600s. And, you know, I love historical fiction that focuses on women's narratives. It has, you know, different time periods, different point of view. So surely I will enjoy all those things. I found this book super readable. Like, it is a book that I could probably have sat and read in like an afternoon. But because of that, I thought the writing style was like really basic. There was nothing that I was reading that I was like, God, that's really well written. It was just like flat and fine. And I also felt that like it was using sort of key themes that we see a lot in sort of Gothic historical fiction that are like super overdone. And I can accept those things being used if they're used in like a well-crafted way. I just didn't think they were. So it was sort of delivering me a checkbox of what we see in Gothic historical fiction in a really basic way. So like I just felt like, why would I waste my time with it? But that was one I really thought I would like based on the premise. So that was a shame. The next question is to talk about a book I enjoyed that didn't seem like it would be my taste. And the only book I could think of for this is Normal People by Sally Rooney. So this had been out for I think quite a few months, and I'd heard everybody rave about it, and I was convinced I would never read it because I wouldn't like it. And I thought I wouldn't like it because the way people were describing the writing style made it sound quite like detached and clinical, and like I said, those are things I really don't enjoy. I then got sent, I think, like a press package with this in it and a couple of other things. And I thought I'll just like read the first couple of pages, and I was immediately hooked. There is something about Sally Rooney's writing style that reminds me of the sort of books I read when I was a teenager. They were about like relationships and the sort of romance that I was like, I'd just inhale. And I'd read, and like when I was a teenager, I would literally finish the last page and go back to the first and read it again. And I would very regularly get a new book, and within a week of having it, I've read it like 3 or 4 times in a row because I'd be that obsessed. And this feels like an adult version of those books that I loved. And weirdly, I then started watching the TV series with Johnny, and he couldn't stand the characters, couldn't stand how they couldn't ever communicate. And he was like, if they had one adult conversation, all of their problems would be solved. And I was like, yeah, I sort of see your point. So I also do struggle with books where there is a level of privilege that isn't dealt with. I think Sally Rooney does deal with that within this book, but I wonder if I reread it, if I would find this book a bit more frustrating than I did the first time. But this is a book that I absolutely adored at the time I read it and was really surprised to love. Next question is for me to mention a few books that are on my TBR that sound like they're going to be exactly my reading taste. So I have a couple of books I recently got from the library, and the first of which is a family drama that I think is from a couple of different perspectives within a family, and follows them over a lot of years. So that sounds interesting. And that is A History of Burning by Janika Oza. This is about a family who, the married couple, we start with them as young children, and they leave India and both end up meeting, I think near the East African Railway, and build this life together in Uganda. And then during Idi Amin's reign, their family have to flee, and they flee to Canada. So yeah, I love family dramas. I, in particular, like I said, like family dramas or sort of any narrative that focus on feelings of like not belonging or displacement. And I've read a couple of novels set in Uganda during Idi Amin's reign, and think it's like a really interesting moment to read about, and just the things people had to go through and the upheaval they had in their lives was catastrophic. So I think I could really love that one. And then I have a non-fiction book called Rural, The Lives of the Working Class Countryside by Rebecca Smith. Like I said, I enjoy non-fiction that is a blend of the personal and the socio-political. I enjoy books that are set in the countryside, and I'm very interested, I don't think I mentioned this, in reading from like a working class perspective. So yeah, I think I'll really enjoy this. I like books that give me like a sense of nostalgia. I grew up in a seaside town, but in a very rural county, so I think there'll be a lot in this that I probably relate to. I'm hoping to really enjoy it. And one that has just come out, and I'm actually going to go pick up my pre-order from the bookshop today, is Penance by Eliza Clark. This is probably one of my most like anticipated releases of the year. It sounds really interesting. So it's that sort of like literary fiction that has that dark, twisty element that I mentioned. It says it's been nearly a decade since the horrifying murder of 16-year-old Joan Wilson rocked Crow-on-Sea, and the events of that terrible night are now being published for the first time. So we move through all the inhabitants of this seaside town, and we get all these different elements of the story. It says it's built on hours of interviews with witnesses and family members, painstaking historical research, and most notably correspondence with the killers themselves. And the result is a riveting snapshot of lives rocked by tragedy and a town left in turmoil. So I think it's going to be like a really interesting look at true crime and how so many people are obsessed with it. Also, the discussion of the sort of stories we give a voice to in the public eye. I found all these things really interesting. And yeah, I think her writing style is really interesting and has like a very dark edge to it. And the next question is to mention a couple of booktubers who have similar tastes to me that I watch. And the two people that immediately always come to my mind are Chris and Sabrina. So Chris has a channel called Chris's Bookish Cauldron. Sabrina has a channel called Bookish Sabrina, although she is taking a pause right now. I think all of her previous videos are still public. And they're as close to my reading taste as you can get. There are still some books we just disagree on. That's always going to be the case. I don't think you're ever going to come across someone who has exactly your reading taste. But yeah, both of them tend to read a lot of literary fiction. And Chris is the person I go to for like all of my fantasy recommendations, because he likes the same sort of slow-paced, character-focused fantasy as I do. And yeah, I trust both of them implicitly. And if they recommend a book and really rave about it, I always am willing to give that book a chance. So if you don't watch them and you like the sort of books I talk about, then I would definitely go and subscribe to them. And then it says, have you always had this taste in books, or has it changed over time? I think it's probably just developed. So I stopped reading when I was at university. And when I finished, I sort of got straight back into reading and then very quickly started this channel. And I think that the sort of books I'm now saying are probably maybe like a bit basic and like simply written, I would have maybe read those ones 10 years ago and enjoyed them. There's certainly books I look back on my Goodreads that I know I rated like 4 or 5 stars that now I'd be like, God, like I don't enjoy that at all. And so I think my reading has just developed in that, you know, I read more ambitious books than I would have read 10 years ago, but I think my tastes are still, you know, the same, in that I still like the same type of themes. I'm still interested in the same type of stories. I think I've just become a more confident reader, probably is the word for it. And then it says to tag some people. So I'm going to tag Chris, because I would love to hear Chris talk about all these things and see which books he shows. I'm also going to tag Jennifer from Jennifer Loves Books. I really enjoy her channel. I'm going to tag Kit from Kit the Reader. Also would love to hear Kit talk about their answers to these questions. And I'm also going to tag Amelia from Amelia Barlow Reads and Ben from Ben Reads Good. I really enjoy all the channels, so I'd definitely recommend you go and check them out. Yeah, thanks for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these questions, like what you would have answered. If you can think of any books that really like a good example of your reading taste, I would love to know. And like I said, any recommendations to any of these sort of themes I mentioned, I would love to hear them. So thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to Harriet for tagging me. I really enjoyed doing this, although it's taken me ages to figure out which books I wanted to talk about. And I'm sure this video is really rambly and long, so good luck to me in editing. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.